She stood at my front gate wearing an elegant silk dress and gold-rimmed glasses, speaking with the confidence of someone who believed every word she said was law. "You'll sign the property transfer papers next week," she declared without hesitation. "My son needs a peaceful place to recover." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I glanced toward the calm waters of Cedar Lake before meeting her eyes again. "No." The single word caught her completely off guard. She tilted her head slightly, as though she had just heard a language she didn't understand. "You clearly don't know who you're talking to," she said coldly. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," I replied. Then I turned toward my front door. "And you're standing on my land." Neither Marion Chadwick nor her son Bryce had any idea those 5 simple words would become the beginning of the biggest mistake of their lives. That morning, I had been repairing the 3rd wooden step leading down to my dock. The old boards had finally started to wear after years of harsh winters and summer storms. As I worked with my hammer, I heard the sharp clicking of high heels crunching across the gravel driveway. It wasn't the relaxed sound of a friendly neighbor stopping by for a visit. These footsteps were slow, deliberate, and confident, the kind made by someone who already believed they owned the place they were walking into. I set my tools down and turned around. The cabin behind me wasn't just another lake house. My father had built it with his own hands back in the early 1970s. Every beam supporting the roof, every slightly uneven floorboard, every window carefully positioned to overlook Cedar Lake had been placed there with purpose. He had chosen this exact piece of land because the morning sunlight reflected perfectly across the water, filling the cabin with warmth before most people were even awake. When he passed away, I inherited the property 11 years earlier. Since then, I had cared for it exactly the way he would have wanted. I replaced worn dock planks before they became dangerous. I repaired the weathered siding after every storm season. I maintained every tree, every fence post, and every inch of shoreline with the same pride my father once had. Never, not even once, did I imagine I would someday have to defend this family home from people trying to claim it as their own. Just inside the front entrance of the cabin hung one of my father's favorite possessions. It was an official county land survey dated 1973, framed behind glass. The paper had yellowed with age, but every measurement remained perfectly clear. Every property marker, every boundary line, and every official county stamp was still visible. Growing up, I always thought it was simply another one of my father's habits. As a retired engineer, he loved maps, measurements, and paperwork. At the time, I had no idea that faded document would one day become the single most important item inside the entire house. Standing in my driveway was Marion Chadwick. Beside her stood her 30-year-old son, Bryce. Bryce barely acknowledged my existence. Instead, his eyes wandered across the cabin, the porch, the dock, the shoreline, and even the surrounding trees. He wasn't admiring the property. He looked like a real estate investor mentally redesigning land he already believed belonged to him. Marion didn't waste a second pretending this was a friendly conversation. She immediately launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. "The HOA board has been discussing a community reallocation proposal," she announced. "Under our neighborhood guidelines, we're identifying properties that can better serve community needs." She gestured toward Bryce. "My son requires a recovery-oriented living environment." Then she used another phrase that sounded like it had been copied directly from a legal memo. "We are seeking an equitable redistribution of underutilized community assets." I stared at her for a moment before asking the simplest question possible. "Which article in the HOA governing documents gives you that authority?" Without missing a beat, Marion replied that the board had already reviewed the framework. I folded my arms. "No," I said calmly. "Which article, Marion?" For the first time, her confidence cracked just a little. She smiled politely and said, "It really isn't productive to get lost in technical details." That answer told me everything I needed to know. Without another word, I walked inside the cabin. A few moments later, I returned carrying 2 documents. The first was my original property deed. The second was a complete copy of the official HOA governing documents I had requested from the county recorder's office several months earlier. I placed both documents carefully on the porch railing between us. Then I opened the HOA handbook and pointed directly to the section that defined the board's legal authority. "Show me," I said quietly. "Point to the rule that says you can take private property from its lawful owner." I opened the property deed and pointed directly to the section describing the official boundary lines. Then I raised my hand and pointed toward the tree line where those boundaries had remained unchanged for decades. Marion never bothered to look at the documents. She never even glanced at the legal description of the property. Instead, she stared beyond the papers, her eyes fixed on the shimmering lake, as though legal ownership was nothing more than an inconvenience standing between her and the view she wanted. That told me everything. She wasn't interested in facts. She wasn't interested in the law. "Our conversation is over," I said calmly. Without waiting for another response, I turned around and walked back inside the cabin. From the side window, I watched Marion and Bryce make their way back across the gravel driveway. Before they even reached the front gate, Marion had already pulled out her phone. Her lips moved rapidly as she spoke to someone, her expression growing more irritated with every step. She wasn't giving up. She was planning her next move. I glanced at the kitchen clock and wrote down the exact time in a notebook. 2:14 p.m. Then I grabbed a brand new notebook from my desk and wrote a title across the front page. Marion Chadwick, Incident Log. From that moment forward, every conversation, every letter, every visit, every photograph, and every unusual event would be carefully documented. Years in construction engineering had taught me one important lesson. Memories fade. Documents don't. The very next morning, I contacted the surveying company I had trusted for years. They had handled commercial projects for me in the past, and I knew they wouldn't cut corners. I requested a complete and updated boundary verification for my entire property. If Marion wanted to argue over property lines, I intended to have the most accurate measurements available. Later that evening, while reviewing county parcel maps on my computer, I noticed something I had somehow overlooked all these years. Just north of the HOA office sat a narrow strip of land, roughly 30 feet wide. Everyone in the neighborhood treated it as HOA property. Cars occasionally parked there. Maintenance crews stored equipment there. The landscaping blended seamlessly with the association's grounds. Naturally, everyone assumed it belonged to the HOA. But according to the county records, it didn't. I zoomed in several times, convinced I had made a mistake. The parcel registration listed only one owner, Douglas Scott, my father. For several seconds, I simply stared at the computer screen. Then I reached for my notebook, carefully wrote down the parcel number, and underlined it twice. Something about that discovery told me it would matter later. A week passed. The surveyors completed their work and installed fresh survey stakes exactly along my legal property lines. Bright markers now clearly identified every corner and boundary of my land. Apparently, Marion saw them as a personal insult. Before sunrise the following morning, I found an official-looking envelope pushed beneath my front door. The letter carried the HOA logo across the top. According to Marion, I had violated Article 14B by installing unauthorized construction markers. The notice demanded that every survey stake be removed within 72 hours. Failure to comply, it warned, would result in daily financial penalties. At first glance, the letter looked convincing. There was only one problem. Article 14B didn't exist. I pulled out my complete copy of the HOA governing documents. I checked every page. Nothing. Then I reviewed every amendment officially filed with the county recorder. Still nothing. There had never been an Article 14B. Not in the original bylaws. Not in any amendment. Not anywhere. More importantly, no rule gave the HOA authority to stop a homeowner from marking the legal boundaries of privately owned land. By late that morning, I had written confirmation from the county clerk stating exactly that. The document clearly explained that licensed survey markers placed on private property were entirely lawful and outside the HOA's authority. That was all I needed. I drafted my response with the same discipline I had learned throughout my career.
No anger. No insults. No emotional speeches.
Just facts. I attached copies of the authentic HOA governing documents. I included the county clerk's written statement. Then I prepared a side-by-side comparison showing every false claim contained in Marion's notice. The differences spoke for themselves. I mailed the package by certified mail and carefully filed the receipt with the rest of my records. Everything was documented. Everything was organized. That afternoon, my phone rang. Marion. I answered. She barely managed 2 sentences before I interrupted her. From this point forward, I said evenly, all communication must be in writing. Before she could argue, I ended the call. That evening, she took her complaints online. In the neighborhood social media group, she posted a lengthy message accusing an unnamed homeowner of creating hostile property boundaries and damaging the spirit of the community. She never mentioned my name. She didn't have to. Attached to the post was a photograph of my newly installed survey stakes. Everyone in the neighborhood immediately knew exactly who she was talking about. I quietly took screenshots of the entire post, along with every comment that followed. Then I closed the page. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I simply added another entry to the Marion Chadwick incident log. Sometimes, silence becomes the strongest evidence of all. A day later, I received an unexpected phone call from Eleanor Voss. Eleanor was 71 years old and lived just a few houses away from the HOA office. When she opened the door, the first thing I noticed wasn't her age. It was the exhaustion in her eyes. It was the look of someone who had spent months being confused, pressured, and slowly convinced that their own memory couldn't be trusted. She invited me inside without saying much. Once we sat down at her kitchen table, she quietly slid a thick folder across the surface. I think there are others, she said softly. Her story began 14 months earlier. Someone from the HOA had visited her home with paperwork they described as a simple consent form allowing landscapers to plant decorative hedges along the fence line. It sounded harmless. She signed it without giving it another thought. 3 months later, she received a maintenance invoice for land she supposedly no longer owned. Confused, she requested copies of every document connected to the transaction. Buried deep inside the paperwork was something she had never intended to sign. Hidden among pages of legal language was a property transfer that quietly moved nearly 4,000 square feet of her backyard into something called a private maintenance trust. Without realizing it, Eleanor had legally surrendered a large section of her own property. She had been tricked. The name of the trust, the filing date, the notarization details, every signature, every reference number, every piece of information that could eventually matter. Then I spent the next 3 days researching every parcel history connected to the Cedar Lake Association. There were 47 properties in total. By the end of the second day, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Over the previous 5 years, 11 different properties had quietly gone through what were described as voluntary easement transfers or covenant modifications. On paper, every transaction appeared perfectly legal. In reality, small strips of privately owned land had slowly disappeared from homeowners and ended up somewhere else. 7 of those transfers all led to the exact same company, Lakeview Corridor Development Partners. The registered agent listed on every filing was the same man, Bryce Chadwick. At that moment, everything finally made sense. This had never been about a caring mother trying to find a peaceful lake house for her son. This was something much larger. A carefully organized land acquisition operation disguised as ordinary HOA management. As I continued studying the parcel maps, another realization hit me. My cabin wasn't simply another attractive waterfront property. It was the missing piece. Because of its location along the shoreline, my parcel connected several other pieces of land together. Without my property, they could never create the continuous stretch of lakefront required to qualify for a much larger commercial development permit. Suddenly, Marion's obsession with my cabin made perfect sense. She didn't just want it. She needed it. Once she realized I wasn't going to cooperate, her tactics became even more aggressive. A second post appeared in the neighborhood community group. This time she mentioned me by name. She accused me of harassing HOA leadership, intimidating neighbors, and disrupting the peace of the community. What caught my attention wasn't the accusation. It was one specific detail. She mentioned the exact date and approximate time I had visited Eleanor's house. That meant someone had been watching the property, or reporting every visitor to Marion. Either way, it confirmed that the intimidation campaign had grown far beyond simple HOA politics. I refused to respond online. Instead, I made 2 important phone calls. The first was to Dante Cruz, an investigative journalist I had met years earlier during a zoning board dispute. Are you interested in a story involving HOA corruption and real estate fraud? I asked. There was a brief silence. Then Dante replied, How much evidence do you have? Enough to get started, I answered. My second call was to Patricia Oakes, an attorney who specialized in community association law. After reviewing everything I had collected, she leaned back in her chair and gave me an opinion that changed my entire strategy. Marion isn't simply bending the rules, she said. She's creating paperwork that looks legitimate long enough to pressure people into surrendering their rights. Those words stayed with me. A few days later, Marion announced an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was written in complicated legal language, but the objective couldn't have been clearer. She wanted an official record labeling me as a non-compliant homeowner. She wanted to censure me, weaken my standing within the association, and create paperwork that could later be used against me. Patricia gave me only 3 instructions. Attends. Say as little as possible. And don't sign anything. The meeting took place the following evening. Out of 47 households, only 14 representatives attended. Less than 1/5 of the community. I already knew the bylaws required at least 30% participation before any official vote could become legally binding. Marion never mentioned that requirement. Instead, she immediately called for a vote against me. 11 hands were raised. 2 homeowners abstained. Only Eleanor voted against Marion's proposal. Without acknowledging the missing quorum, Marion confidently announced that the motion had passed and immediately attempted to adjourn the meeting. I said nothing. I simply opened my notebook and carefully documented every procedural violation.
No quorum verification.
Several ineligible households allowed to vote despite outstanding HOA fees. No complete membership roster distributed before the meeting. Questions from homeowners ignored or refused on the official record. Every violation was recorded. The following morning, Patricia reviewed my notes. Her conclusion matched exactly what I had expected. The vote is legally invalid, she said. In fact, it's invalid for multiple independent reasons. But the most important discovery wasn't the failed vote itself. It proved that Marion was intentionally manipulating official procedures to manufacture authority she never actually possessed. First, I called the sheriff's office. My second call was to Patricia. Prepare everything, I told her. fraud, burglary, intimidation, every single charge that applies. I want a complete case package ready for both the court and the prosecutor. The third call was to Dante. I'm ready, I said. A few days later, another crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place. Greg Salter, the HOA secretary, left me a voicemail asking if we could meet somewhere outside the neighborhood. We agreed on a small diner 12 miles east of Cedar Lake. Greg looked nervous when he arrived. He kept checking the windows before sitting down across from me. Without saying much, he slid a padded envelope across the table. I couldn't stay after I started asking questions, he admitted quietly. According to Greg, Marion had forced him out after he questioned a mysterious $22,000 reserve fund expense that had no supporting invoice or documentation. Inside the envelope were photocopies of meeting minutes from 11 HOA meetings that had never been entered into the official records. These weren't ordinary meetings. They were private sessions held after the official meetings had already been adjourned. Sometimes only 3 people were present: Marion, Bryce, and one other board member. The notes were detailed. Specific parcels. Then I found my own name. It appeared in meeting notes dated 8 months before Marion had ever knocked on my front gate. The handwritten note read, "Lake frontage. High priority approach after VOS transfer confirmed." I stared at the page for several seconds. That single sentence proved everything. I had never been chosen at random. I had been targeted months before our first conversation. That evening, Patricia reviewed every document Greg had provided. "We have enough." She explained that the evidence now supported criminal referrals for HOA fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to obtain property through deception, and additional evidence connected to the unlawful entry into my cabin. "When do you want to move?" she asked. "1 more week," I answered. Because by then I knew exactly how I was going to expose the entire operation. The forgotten 30-foot strip of land my father had purchased decades earlier was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. The next morning, I called a fencing contractor I had trusted for years. I gave him the dimensions listed on my father's deed and asked what it would take to install a 6-foot black steel security fence around the entire parcel with a single access gate. He estimated 5 business days for permits and 2 more days for installation. "Start immediately," I told him. The following Monday arrived cold and perfectly still. Before sunrise, the first steel fence post was lowered into freshly dug concrete. Everything had been approved. Every permit was valid. Every survey had been certified. Every inch of land legally belonged to me. By the time Marion's silver sedan pulled into the HOA parking lot later that morning, nearly 1/3 of the fence had already been completed. She slammed her car door and stormed toward the construction crew. "You need to stop this immediately," she shouted. The foreman calmly handed her the county-issued permit. She looked at the paperwork. Then she looked at the fence. Then at the parcel map identifying the legal owner. For a brief moment, she couldn't even find the words. Instead, she called the police. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes. They carefully reviewed the construction permit, confirmed the survey records, checked the county parcel database, and reached exactly the conclusion Marion had hoped they wouldn't. The land was privately owned. The permits were valid. The construction fully complied with county regulations. There was absolutely no legal basis to stop the project. By then, several neighbors had gathered to watch. Eleanor arrived first. Greg stood quietly near the back. Several homeowners who had privately shared their concerns with me over the previous weeks also came to witness what was happening. Soon afterward, Dante arrived with a camera operator. A few minutes later, an unmarked sedan pulled into the lot carrying a representative from the district attorney's office, a meeting Patricia had quietly arranged in advance. At precisely 9:45 that morning, I walked toward them carrying 3 thick manila envelopes. One was handed to the senior sheriff's deputy. One went to Dante. The third was given to the representative from the district attorney's office. Each envelope contained exactly the same evidence. Recertified land surveys. Fraudulent HOA amendment documents. Invalid meeting records. Complete parcel transfer histories. Greg's confidential meeting minutes. The burglary report. The pre-signed property transfer agreement left inside my cabin. Corporate filings identifying Bryce Chadwick as the registered agent of the LLC. Financial records connecting the land transfers to a much larger development project. The complete package totaled 114 pages. Every page was tabbed. Every document was organized. Every claim was supported by evidence. There would be no way to explain it away. And there would be no way to bury the truth anymore.